So we started a brand new series,
Yeah.
and it's called Ever Wonder Why? What is this series about? Let's start there.
We have thought a lot about what the conversations are around the church and around the world. There's a handful of like really human questions, ones that you don't have to be religious, you don't have to necessarily be spiritual to ask.
Yeah,
Questions like, who am I?
yeah,
And what's my purpose? And one of those ones that you kind of inadvertently rub up against, that you bump into along the way, is, why do bad things happen?
yeah.
Why do I suffer? Why do people around me suffer? Why do bad things happen to good people?
Right.
And we thought that this would be worthwhile diving into, because the Bible doesn't shy away from it.
Yeah. So this is not an apologetic series. This is more like a theology meets philosophical. These are the tough life questions.
Yeah, yeah. And
That
I do think you can build an apologetic. You can start with this sort of thing, but really, I think
but
we're trying to meet people where they're at in the
yeah,
beginnings of these conversations and just flesh it out a little bit.
yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's interesting. But you won't be covering topics like were dinosaurs and humans living on the planet at the same time,
No, but I'm
right?
interested in your take on this.
You're not interested in my take on that. But this week, you guys pull no punches.
Yeah.
You literally start the sermon, tell us what the series is about,
Yeah.
and then you're like, why do bad things happen?
Yeah, I think every one of our teaching pastors has some sort of like moment of dissonance where they have asked, why me? Why is this happening to me? Or why is this happening to somebody that I love? This is no secret for you, and we've talked to our church about this 1,000 times, but the rubber hit the road for this with me when Megan and I went through that stretch where it's like we just kept miscarrying. And
Yeah.
for somebody that's on like God's team, right? If there's anybody that should be, I feel like, get the blessing, like should be able to raise the godly family, should it be the person that is taking care of everybody else's family and is working with God hand in hand?
Yeah.
Why in the world would we go through what we went through? So for me, this,
It doesn't make sense that good people suffer. Only bad people who deserve it should suffer.
yeah, like that's my mind makes sense of it that
Yeah.
way,
But
but
everybody thinks that they're the good
that
person
they're the
in
good
that
person
in that
and that
scenario.
everybody else
Yeah.
or whatever. Yeah,
Do you think that
for
that's a
sure.
problem, that people think that they don't deserve to suffer, and then that creates beef with God?
Man, I think so. Like when you talk about the problem of evil, like that's how I'll like encapsulate this. When you talk about the problem of evil, problem of suffering, why do bad things happen to good people? Like you're making some assumptions with that question, like from the start.
Immediately when you said that, I would say I wanted to push back because I want to say, why do we assume that suffering is evil
Yeah, or who is good?
or who is good?
Like when you say good person, what constitutes that? Like,
At least someone who's worthy of suffering.
yeah, yeah, sometimes.
Not to pick on smokers, because a lifelong smoker will be ask themselves the same question: why is this happening to me? Even though it says on the box.
Yeah, it is.
But
I don't want to
but
jump ahead, but it is interesting how sometimes, I think about the audacity of man
yeah,
to say when we talk about like, is God out there? Is God good? Look at the way I'm suffering. It is funny to me because it's like a lot of times we play that card that's like, how audacious, how arrogant. We're like the person that, like, you're like a person that kills his parents and throws yourself on the mercy of the court for being an orphan, And you're like,
oh
people are
yeah.
looking at this and you're like, this is your fault. You brought about some of this. That certainly can be the case
Well, yeah,
sometimes.
and in some instances it does feel like, oh, this is my choice. In some instances it feels like an abused kid is not suffering because they made a bad choice, because they're evil or they're wicked, but is directly related to their parents' wickedness,
Right.
evil, their own struggle with flesh.
Sure. Sure.
So
And,
what I mean,
and that's like what I alluded to at the start. Like,
but then there are acts of God, people who lose their houses because of hurricanes
sure,
or
sure.
because they were born in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Yeah.
Is that are all of those considered evil? Are any of them evil?
Yeah. Well, I think we got to go back to the start.
Okay.
I think we got to go back to the beginning, and talk about what is evil, like define that,
Okay.
because somebody may call one thing good and somebody else may call another thing, that same thing, evil, right? Kind of depends on whose perspective we're looking from. So I think we got to define what we mean by evil. That'll give us some clarity for these different things that have happened along the way. Your fault, not your fault, circumstances, world around you, whatever's happened along the way. It'll give you some parameters for, okay, this is genuinely bad, or maybe not. So I think we got to go back to the start, maybe define what evil is when we talk about that.
All right. Well, let's talk about it then. What is evil?
Yeah. So in the very beginning, right? Stop me if you've heard this one before.
Okay.
In the very beginning, God creates the heavens and the earth, calls the world good.
Right.
All his creation, he looks about, it's good. And then he stacks the deck. Like from my observation, he stacks the deck. He says, there's two people here who I love so much, and I want them to love me back. And so I give them this beautiful thing called choice.
Okay.
Because without choice, there's no love, right? I mean, you can't have a robot who loves you. You can't,
Right.
you can design it so that you've prescripted this kind of thing and it acts on what you've requested here. But for somebody to truly love, they have to have that volition to choose.
Right.
Right? So he creates these two people, gives them the power to choose. And then he stacks the deck. He says, throughout the whole garden, enjoy it, love it, take it all in. But there's just one thing that you can't do.
Okay.
One thing. And what does humanity do?
That one thing.
That one thing.
Probably immediately.
Right? Like, yeah, it probably didn't take them too long
Yeah.
to get there. Yeah. And it was from that act that sin and the consequences, the curse of death, ends up coming in and wrecking everything. And so from the very beginning, this starts with choice. This starts with human action here. Sin enters, corrupts everything. And so, if we're going to define what evil is here, we're going to start with the origination point. And it begins with human choice here. And from there, we get 6 chapters into Genesis,
Okay.
and the wheels have come off, right? God's like,
Everything.
we got to start over.
Everything is terrible.
Yeah.
All the time.
Yeah. So you see, from that choice, there comes about murder. This is
Right.
Cain and Abel. We see this. There comes about disaster. The earth is hardened, and it doesn't make the kind of things that it used to without toil and blood and
Yeah,
sweat.
I think that's the thing that we often forget is that when we fail, it wasn't just all of us, it was all of creation that fell with us.
Everything.
Yeah, and
Like,
Hebrews actually, yeah,
You corrupted everything. Yeah.
yeah, and Hebrews talks about how all creation yearns,
It's groaning.
And
It's
when-
waiting for the day.
and everything is waiting for the day to be redeemed.
Yeah, and I think that's maybe a great jumping off point. It's like, so when somebody asks, like, why do these bad things happen? There's some people where you could draw the line for natural consequence, and you can say, hey, you did this, and it brought about this.
Yeah.
But there's other folks along the way when it's like, man, what? I didn't choose this. I was doing the right thing, and yet still evil, suffering happens. And that's a result of the fall.
So all of it is a result of the fall, and all of my friends who are not Christians would look me in the eyes if I were to say that, and they would be like, well, then God is not good if he would give us a choice that he would know would end in suffering. If it seems like God's plan was suffering all along.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a fair assumption?
I think if you don't have a biblical worldview, I can certainly see how you would get there.
Yeah.
But I think if you know the story, then you look at a life like Joseph. That's what's ringing in my head right now is Genesis 50:20. After everything Joseph goes through, all the evil along the way, he looks his brothers in the eyes. I don't know if you remember the line, but he says, what the world meant for evil, God has meant for good.
Good.
You know, and so I think if you don't have a biblical worldview, I see how you get there. I
So
definitely do.
give me one sentence that defines evil before we move on, because I already have a great question for you. That if you were to just summarize this, would you say that that you're describing evil as the consequences of the free will of man?
Yeah, I think anything that goes against the nature and the plan of God is evil.
Yeah. But evil was, in that definition, evil is contrary to the plan of God.
Yeah, I don't think that God is the one that is orchestrating evil around us, but I think God uses the consequences and the effects of evil for our good still.
Yeah.
You know, there are some things, there are things that God allows that it's a bit like, from where we sit. Have you ever seen tapestry before? You ever like seen woven
Oh,
tapestry?
yeah.
Have you seen the back of them before?
Yeah, they're a mess.
Yeah, that's kind of the way I think of it. Is like from my perspective,
A
a lot of
knotted
times
mess. Yeah.
when I look at the evil and the circumstances around me, it's a knotted mess. And it's only in hindsight, like when I kind of get a real look at what's at work here, or flip it over, get a better view, a better perspective, that I see, okay, maybe there was more happening here than I realized.
Yeah. So here's the thing that you are saying. I don't know if you're saying this intentionally, but the thing that the big takeaway seems to be in all of this, that ultimately evil exists in the world as a result of the free will of man. If A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C, right? Then suffering exists because that's the heart of the matter. Why do I suffer? I'm a good person. Why are there disasters in the world? Why did my grandma get cancer? She prayed every day. She did all the right things. Why? And you're saying that all of that is the result of free will, and that free
Yeah.
will, suffering is the consequence of free will.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, let me butt in here. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. But I'm not. Gosh, when we put it like that, when you like are treat it with like when you're like a reductionist,
Yeah.
when it's like let me boil this down to just like this
Yeah, I
one.
Occam's razor that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it like it does require so much nuance because people ask me this all the time. They're like, "Why? Like you're a pastor, can you tell me why this happened and why this happened and why?" And I ask that question too, and I think we should probably be encouraged because the psalmist in the Bible asked this. Uh, David himself asked this. I mean, I know Elijah he sat under the broom tree praying that God would end his life because he couldn't see a path forward, couldn't see how God was going to work things out, couldn't find the answers, didn't make sense to him.
He
But
was suffering because he was doing the will of God.
because he's doing the right thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So when we treat it in such a matter where it's like, let me just boil all of this down here, it's really hard for me, and I think for any pastor, to say, I know why
Yeah.
you're suffering.
Yeah.
If I trace it back, I do think it goes to a moment. I do think it goes to when evil and sin enter the world. I do think that, ultimately.
Yeah.
But in terms of why, presently, this is happening, I think, Rocky, I think it's like a number of things. I think it could be, um, I think it could be demonic sometimes. I think it could be like, I
Okay.
know, I don't want to open the door here,
Yeah.
okay? I very well think people could suffer because of like demonic evil that is at work.
Right.
I think people suffer because people are idiots.
Yeah.
Sometimes, right? You make a choice, there's a consequence to it. I think people suffer because of the state of the world and the condition that we live in.
Yeah.
Like, you don't sin because, like, you don't. I'm not a sinner because I do bad things.
Right.
I do bad things because I'm a sinner. Like I have a condition, like from the very start.
Right.
And I think that, that's because of that. There's a number of terrible things that have happened. And then I also, I want to leave a little bit of gray area here that it feels like there's Okay, I want to let the mystery be on this, I guess. Like, I don't have easy answers for this, but I think there's also a divine mystery as to how God takes certain moments to reveal his glory in suffering.
Right.
That there may be a why connected to that, maybe. You know, I'm thinking about the man who, the disciples come to Jesus and they're like, why is this guy blind?
Right.
Was it something his parents did or something he did?
Big debate. Yeah.
You know?
Hours. They pulled him in front of,
Yeah. It's like,
yeah, he's
guys,
suddenly in a
he's
legal
blind, not
battle.
deaf.
Yeah.
Like, he's right there. Like,
Yeah.
just chill out for a second, you know?
And ultimately he says, listen, I don't know the answer to your questions. All I know is I was blind, but now I see.
And I think that that's a moment when it's like God may have allowed that to happen for that moment.
Right.
I don't know. You know, this is a tough thing here, and there's
Yeah.
a reason why whole libraries are
Yeah.
filled up with this question and people attempting to answer. So I'm not under any illusion that in our time sitting here, that's like, hey, we're gonna
I
ace this.
literally demand that you solve
Right.
this right now.
Yeah.
Not just for me, but for you.
Yeah, this is tricky, but
Yeah.
this is what I think that the Bible presents.
Do you think, well, I mean, just, I'm going to shift gears here in a second,
Yep.
but when we're going along, like the response to this,
Yep.
when this feels very much like old school, we're all sinners in the hands of an angry God, like this. And I think ultimately we have this conception about the person of God where we say, if God is good, then his will has to play out in a specific way, because we're not actually thinking about God's goodness. We're thinking about Jeremy Fisher's goodness.
Right.
And we're saying, like, we should expect God to behave like we would expect a good man
Yep.
to behave, and
Yep.
his will should be. And we forget that God is not a man,
Yeah.
and that God does not, I'm going to make a statement. I want you to respond to it.
Okay.
God's number one, God loves you, but God's number one commitment is to exercise his plan. And people
Yes.
don't.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. This the people are like, when people talk about what's the one characteristic of God, like if there's one thing that defines God, what people often will say that they'll throw out is God is love.
Yeah.
And I would
say God is jealous.
I would say God
and angry.
is I would say
and
God
just.
is holy. And that's the
And God is holy.
that is the when the angels are in heaven and they're circling the throne, you're not hearing love, love, love is the Lord Almighty.
They're not saying blue skies and rainbows.
Exactly. They're saying holy, holy,
Holy,
holy.
holy.
And holiness is dangerous. Not because
See, this is what I want to talk about.
holiness is dangerous, not because of what's wrong with it, but because of what's right with it. And we are
Jerry, what does that mean?
because we are so broken.
Yeah.
You know, you can't get close to that. Like there's got to be
Our standard is broken, and so when we look at God's holiness, we
Yes.
don't
we don't
understand
understand it.
it. It
Yeah,
feels,
alien. It
Yeah.
feels foreign.
and it makes us angry.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense.
We are reactive to it.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's why at the beginning when we started with the question of like, why do bad things happen to good people? It's like, brother, you got to clarify.
Yeah.
When you say good people, what do you mean by that?
Yeah. Who's good?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
So you guys, but there is like the crux of your sermon, and you're talking about Job. You do talk about Job in this sermon, and he was considered good, right?
righteous. Yeah.
And that's why, like, he was considered righteous by God,
Uh-huh.
in his holiness, considered Job righteous, and that's ultimately what leads to not his downfall, because at the end of the story we know what happens, but God makes a choice for him, or God gives permission.
Yeah.
For Job, and God willingly allows Job
Yep. Yep.
to enter into this suffering. And what is the framework for me as just a normal person compared to Job, who was righteous? By the way, I do not consider myself righteous
Come on.
like Job is righteous. And this is what happened to him. So, as like, what is the benefit of being holy then?
Yeah.
It apparently has no upside.
Yeah. And,
Apparently,
well,
we're not given any special advantages in this life.
And you read a story like that, and oftentimes you want to make it like you read something descriptive like that, and you want to make it prescriptive for your life, where
Right.
you're like, well, if I just will hold out, then I'll get all of this good stuff
Right.
at the end, you know.
So the first thing that you're saying is that Rocky Job is not about you. The book of
Well,
Job is not about you.
I mean, I think there's
It kind of
part,
feels like that's what you're
yeah,
saying to me.
there's parts of it that I think are, but I think, you know, it's also, so yes, I do think that there is a teaching from it, and there's things that we can learn, and there's application for our life. But if you think that if I will just hold out and remain holy, at the end of my life, Jeremy, you'll get the children back that you and Megan lost, that all things are going to be roses at the end of this thing. No, I don't think that's the way it works. I
Dude, you're
think
not
it,
gonna
I,
you're
I
I'm
think it,
not gonna get more grandparents.
I think that there are some scenarios where it's like, yeah, God chose to bring that about. But in the end,
And also I think parents read that and they think you could never replace my kid. Like kids are not
right.
replaceable.
Oh, yeah, sure, sure.
Yeah.
But in the end, I think, gosh, this feels a little bit like a cop out. Forgive me. I hate to go this route.
Oh, I'm gonna make you pay for it. Go ahead.
But, you know, when you place the premium on this life
Yeah.
and you're like, this is it, I better get mine at the end of all this, like, you're setting yourself up for a lot of heartache. And the way that the Bible reads, you know, with the world that is to come, is that there is a day when he wipes away every tear from our eye. There's a day when all things are made new. When I've said this before, and I think it's accurate, that, you know, we will enter into that world, and we'll look back on this one, and it'll feel like one bad night in a cheap motel. You know,
Okay.
we'll look
Yeah.
back on all this. I just don't think that always comes in this life,
Right.
but in the world to come.
So ultimately, when you're saying this, what pops in my mind is, are you saying that, and honestly, I don't even know how I got here from what you just said. Are you saying that ultimately suffering is not about the situation, the suffering, or even the details, but it's really about your sanctification and the life that is to come?
Rocky, again, I feel like when we take the reductionist approach and it's like, here's suffering, this is what it's about. It's about your holiness.
Yeah.
It's
But
hard for
people,
me
but
because it ignores
I
it.
know, but people want, Jeremy,
Yeah,
people need to know that their suffering is significant, that it's for a reason.
yeah,
Because like if I'm just suffering for no, if I get cancer
yeah,
and there is no God and there is no reason, then I might as well just be a nihilist.
yeah,
Why is my Christian faith worth anything
yeah,
at that point?
yeah. I guess what I'm trying to get at is, let me first. I'm in agreement. People will suffer when they know there's purpose.
Yeah.
They will. Like you'll go on stupid diets. You'll when somebody's desperate enough, you get a terminal illness. You will fly to the most obscure country in the world if you hear that they've got some kind of experimental medicine that's working. When you're desperate, like you will go to those lengths. You will do those things. Like when it feels like you're suffering and uh, there's purpose or there's a hope on the
Hmm.
other end of it. People will suffer. It gets dangerous when it feels like there's no reason for my suffering.
Right.
That's when it's hard. I'm in 100% agreement with that. 100%. I just want to be careful to not rob the humanity of every story of suffering. Like when somebody suffers and you reduce it down to, well, this is for the glory of God.
Right.
I think that may be part of it. I truly do.
God can be glorified.
God will be glorified.
Right.
I truly, for believers, Romans 8, Genesis 50, like we talked, that's what God does. That's what's so unique about our faith, is that God does not waste our pain. But I don't want to lose the human story in the midst of that with such a kitschy one-liner,
Yeah.
and reducing it to, hey, have you read Genesis? Hey, have you read Romans 8?
Trying to categorize it feels disrespectful to
It does a little bit
yeah.
to people that are hurting.
Yeah.
It feels trite. It feels like, oh, here we go.
Yeah.
Genesis story. Here we go. God's going to work it out. I think all of those things are true. It's just in the midst of it. I would want people to know that your suffering matters. Yes, there's purpose in the midst of this. That just because one thing is true in all this doesn't, like, you have to be careful to not let your Like one thing that's true leads you to false conclusions.
Right.
Like I don't want to get off track here, but you know, when you suffer, it doesn't mean that your life is over.
Right.
Doesn't mean you'll never be happy again. But I don't want to lose all that in the midst of it. Like there's the human story in all of this, that every one of us is suffering. And even though God uses it for his purposes and uses it for his ways, it, you know, it doesn't mean that he's not with you along the way. Doesn't mean that he doesn't love you. Doesn't mean that he's not intimately involved in the details here. I think all those things can be true in the midst of it.
When we talk then about suffering as a result of free will, does my free will, is it more important that my free will cause the suffering, or how you exercise my free will to respond to the suffering?
I mean, I tend to think the latter, because it's like the former's already done.
Right.
I'm suffering. So now what's in my control? What can I do? So I tend to think that the latter may be more important, but for those that I guess haven't entered into suffering yet, it may be good to recognize what consequences, like what of your actions could lead to suffering. Does that make sense? So
Yeah.
depending on where you're at on the timeline, that those things become maybe more important. That's my thought.
I mean, that's the ultimate question. You guys preach this. We're having this conversation because of this sermon, and in the sermon, you guys do talk a lot about Job, and you talk a lot about free will, and you don't want to boil everything down because you talk about the importance of the human experience. So, what is the conclusion of the sermon? I come to see life on a Sunday morning.
Yeah.
So, am I just depressed for the next week?
Maybe. No. So, you know, we define those parameters, define what evil is. I think in the sermon we touched on this, and we've kind of talked about it here, but I think it's also important to say that there is nobody that's good. And this is where the sermon, this is kind of where we're ending up. So it's important for us to define this too. So we know what evil is. But to answer that question, why do good people suffer?
Which is the ultimate question.
Yeah, it's that that's only happened once, you know? That's never in history happened. It's
Yeah.
only happened one time.
Yeah.
People are like, well, what about babies? Babies are innocent. I'm like, no, they're not. Have you held it? Like, when we put...
It's funny because me and Caleb Collins argue about this all the time.
Oh, really?
Yeah, we have pretty intense debates. He thinks I'm an idiot.
Well,
yeah.
For me, look no further. When we put River down to sleep, like when she goes to take a nap, she's 9 months. She arches her back and she cries out as if to say, not your will, but mine. Like, I don't want to sleep.
You're not the boss.
You're not the boss. And I'm like, you're 9 months. Like, who taught you this?
Oh,
what is wrong with you? And it's because from the very start, you're infected with this, like this nature. And so when you figure out that nobody's good, this is so key. Like, you don't understand the gospel until you understand this. I believe that. Until you realize that there is nobody that's good.
Right.
You are broken from the very start. People are like, well, my grandmother's, she's a saint. I'm like, your granny is a dirty, rotten sinner.
Well,
right?
But I think you're right, because I think intellectually we know that the penalty for sin is death. I think intellectually we understand all of that. But if I were to come to you, Joe Schmo, and I said, Jeremy, okay, what sin have you committed that is worthy of the death penalty then?
I'd be like, nothing.
Nothing.
I'm not that bad.
And how can both of those things be true? How can you tell me that the penalty for sin is death, and then say that you get it when you don't believe that you deserve death?
Exactly. And that, I mean, that's a separate video in itself. That's a separate talk whenever you talk about why is death necessary to satisfy.
But your conclusion then is, not that this is your conclusion, but just to make sure that we're on the same page here, you're saying that the question is flawed. Why do bad things happen to good people? Because it's only happened once.
It's only happened once.
You are exempt from that question, so you don't even have to worry about it. You get, what do we deserve? You're saying we deserve death
from the start.
And anything that happens to you that is not death is
grace upon grace.
Is grace upon grace. And then when you actually do die, that was exactly what was supposed to happen.
Yeah.
That seems mean.
It's the truth, you
It
know?
seems hurtful.
I know it's tough.
That doesn't sound like a gospel I want
Uh,
to.
I know it's tough, but when you recognize, this is what makes the gospel so sweet, Rocky, is that it's not that Jesus saves bad people. It's that Jesus only saves bad people. Like there's
Yeah.
not like nobody, no, there is nobody that's good. And once you realize that it's like, this is what's so sweet is that I never should have been. The better question is not why do bad things, it may be, if you ask yourself, why don't more bad things happen to me? Like
Yeah.
why am I not purely some object of wrath? That's what I deserve.
Yeah.
But instead it's like, the gospel is so sweet, Jesus is so sweet. It is grace upon grace upon grace that even the sun rises on those who are righteous and those who are not.
Yeah.
You know, like, yeah, I'm always interested when people ask me like, why is there evil in the world? I'm always like, have you thought to ponder the like the the inverse of that? Why is there good?
Mm,
Why is there so much good that's out there?
that's a great question. Well, thank you, Jeremy. I appreciate your time,
Yeah,
man.
man, this is a, like I said, toughest of the tough
Yeah.
when it comes to hard questions. And I mean, as a pastor, it's like my
Yeah.
least favorite thing to boil things down. And it's like, well, this is why. Because it's like when you sit across from somebody who is suffering,
Yeah.
it's like, this is a different language you're speaking. And
Right.
so it's so important to me that along the way, we don't lose what suffering is for somebody. Like that you empathize and that you hurt with them and that you're gentle with these sorts of things. So answers to these questions for Christians a lot of time feel like apologetic ammunition.
Right.
And instead it's like, no, just let this be a framework for how you tenderly deal with people,
Right.
you know? So still want to lose that in the middle of it.
Yeah. Definitely good stuff. And the whole series is like this?
All the like all the tough questions along the
Yeah.
way that it's like you may have felt a little sheepish to ask in church. Yeah, we're going to hit them.
Yeah. All
It's
right.
good stuff.
Thanks, man.
Yeah. My pleasure.